me turn now to Mr. Eric LeCompte from the Jubilee USA Network, and acknowledging the importance of civil society in raising awareness and advocating on behalf of effective response and recovery. Mr. LeCompte, Jubilee, with over 100 other organizations, has asked the G20 and other major donors to cancel debt payments and expand debt relief for developing countries that are being hit by this crisis. What is the most compelling argument in favor of those measures, and how do we go from here toward a durable solution for debt sustainability, especially given the magnitude of the crisis in many of the developed and donor countries as well? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, David. The coronavirus is wreaking havoc around the globe, and it has induced a global economic crisis on par with the Great Depression. Our calls for debt cancellation, as you know, relief and increased aid are needed to meet the $2.5 trillion initial IMF estimate to address the crisis in developing countries. We also can't forget the Sustainable Development Goals, and the UN Conference on Trade and Development notes we need $5 to $7 trillion to meet those goals. Due to this crisis, according to UN agencies, 265 million people now face famine. 40 to 60 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty, and the International Labor Organization says 300 million jobs will be lost. Job loss, unemployment, and poverty are recipes for social unrest, conflict, terrorism, inequality, and financial crisis. This precipitates our calls for debt relief and debt cancellation. Dealing with this current crisis requires additional spending to protect health, workers, and save lives. African finance ministers representing middle-income countries called for $44 billion in debt relief just for African countries as a short-term measure to this crisis. Current measures enacted by the IMF and G20 for all 73 of the poorest countries of debt relief that qualify amount to $22 billion. Most of these poorest countries had less than 50 critical care units for millions of people. Some of these countries had zero. These debt relief measures do not include middle-income developing countries, home to 62% of the world's poor. They do not bind private lenders, and more than half of countries that qualify for these debt cancellation and debt relief measures are refusing the terms or afraid of market consequences. Debt relief measures, which include debt cancellation, debt payment moratoriums, debt standstills, and debt restructuring, are critical, but alone they will not be enough to deal with this profound crisis. And the effects of the crisis will be more long-lasting in developing countries than in advanced economies. Measures must be put in place to evaluate debt sustainability and cancel debt payments into 2021 and possibly 2022 and beyond. It's not even further the elimination of debt stocks. Debt relief must be brought into more countries that need it. Longer term, we must implement the debt policies from the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the 2014 and 2015 UN General Assembly efforts for improving debt restructuring and embracing a global bankruptcy process. In order to emerge from this crisis with resilience, ensure economic and debt sustainability, and be able to access future revenue streams, as you asked, we must move forward now agreements that curb tax evasion and avoidance and corruption. To meet this current crisis, we must count our responses not in the billions, but in the trillions. It's why we must also access global financial reserves or the special drawing rights and allocate the use of these reserves to developing countries. We did it after the 2008 financial crisis, and now we need to do it again. Estimates of need range from 1 to 4 trillion. And finally, Caribbean islands to African nations need to access these revenue streams, aid and relief, so they can pass their own stimulus or bridge financing plans to survive the crisis and ensure funds are available to meet the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks for all of those important points, Eric. May I just ask a follow-up question specifically about the responsibilities of debtors in the crisis? I think you've been very clear about the responsibilities of creditors. What would you say about those who are in need of this financing urgently, and yet for whom there are important questions about how to spend the money well for the long run? What are they responsible for?
Well, and I think this is our most important contribution today. One of the strongest calls from the Financing for Development Addis Ababa Action Agenda was to implement rules on responsible lending and borrowing. While we've seen progress with the G20's operational guidelines for sustainable financing, we still lack binding rules. These common sense laws of debtor and creditor responsibility and public budget transparency should be enshrined as part of international financial architecture. However, the most important and most critical points that I need to make in response to your question today is responding to the very real resistance of private creditors, commercial lenders, and banks to participate in the G20, IMF, and World Bank debt relief calls. Long term, we need changes in the major financial jurisdictions like the United Kingdom and New York State. For countries around the world and for U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, legal changes are needed in these financial jurisdictions to make debt restructuring more transparent and predictable, and to implement another strong commitment from the Addis Ababa Action Agenda that we all agreed on, outlawing predatory vulture funds. Because of the enormity of this crisis, the devastating enormity and the long-term challenges the markets could face, the fact that some private creditor blocks and commercial blocks are not participating at the urging of the United States, the G20, the IMF, and World Bank baffles the mind. Given that this crisis could devastate all of us, poor countries and the markets, the United Nations Security Council has little choice but to act. The UN Security Council should follow its precedent in 2003 when it protected the assets of Iraq from creditor payments, and now immediately makes the same decision for the 73 countries that need this protection most to compel private creditors to join the G20 call. This decision would protect assets of these countries and mandate that debt relief from official bilateral creditors is not used to pay private creditor debts. Additionally, officials must strengthen public announcements that do more than call or invite private creditors. They must make public announcements that say they expect their participation in order to compel it. We welcome stronger announcements from the World Bank David Malpass last week. The IMF and G20 should revise their statements from April and, instead of calling private creditors, expect their participation and further condition public participation in debt relief and debt cancellation on the participation of private and commercial parties. UN agencies must also make these public calls, these public announcements, and the words we use.
We need to ask you to wrap up.
Do have legal implications. The decisions we make now can ensure that we not only survive this health and economic impact of the coronavirus, they can also ensure that we emerge from this crisis with more resilience. The decisions we make now can ensure that we emerge from this crisis with the tools to stop the next crisis.
Thanks for that, and thanks for the clarity about the role of the private sector in this very difficult moment. Eric LeCompte, if you could respond on the question of prioritization of resources or on something else that seemed very important, and briefly. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, David. And to respond to that, as well as the important query from our colleague from Ethiopia, I think there are 2 points that I'd like to make in closing. First, the most important action that as the United Nations we can take away today is compelling the action of private creditors and commercials and banks to join debt relief measures. The only entity that has the true power to do that is the United Nations Security Council, as they did in 2003, where they protected essentially the assets of Iraq. It's essentially, again, moving forward that same decision to protect the assets of the poorest countries and compel all private creditors and commercials to join debt relief and debt cancellation measures. Second, together with all of the people assembled in this virtual gathering, we've achieved great moments before on debt relief and debt cancellation. Because of the work of the United Nations, we have won over $130 billion in debt relief through the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. We've done it before, we could do it again, but right now, as our colleagues know, what we must do is even more serious. After every financial crisis since 1997, we've seen very close movements for enacting a global bankruptcy process. After the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, the International Monetary Fund almost moved forward the sovereign debt resolution mechanism. Then it stopped. After the 2008 financial crisis, the United States, Germany, and world leaders looked at another bankruptcy process to be installed. Again, as we got away from the crisis, it didn't happen, but the United Nations General Assembly in 2014 and 2015 did pass a global bankruptcy regime. In this brief window we have, again, we must pass it because 5 or 6 years from now, we may have another crisis, another economic shock, another pandemic, and the economic impacts of this crisis could have been prevented if we moved forward that bankruptcy process. So those are the 2 takeaways for today. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Eric.